On Thursday, we woke up to the news that a drone attack had been carried out against the Kremlin. An attack, said the Russian leadership, to assassinate President Putin. The first thing to say is that at the time of recording this video, nobody knows anything. There is no evidence about where this drone came from, what its intended purpose was, none of it. Unless new facts come to light, anyone purporting to talk with certainty on the subject is engaged in pure speculation masquerading as something else. Now, I said the same about the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage, and that incident remains unknown, even though various details, claims and counterclaims have been thrown about ever since. However, in this case, I begin sceptical about Russia's case on one detail at least. Clearly, this was not an assassination attempt against Vladimir Putin. It is well known that Putin spends relatively little time in the Kremlin, particularly that he does not stay there overnight. I can't think of many potential perpetrators, state level or internal Putin opposition or whoever, who wouldn't be aware of that. The drones were lightly charged at best, simply not a credible or realistic operation to take out Russia's president. So it is a symbolic strike from wherever it originates. Secondly, it's a legitimate question to wonder how two drones could get this close to the Kremlin in the first place. It's well documented how effective Russian jamming of Ukrainian drones has become within the battlefields of Ukraine itself. It's similarly well attested how well protected the Kremlin is digitally from various forms of potential attack. Indeed, only yesterday one journalist was recounting how even just driving relatively close to the Kremlin sent his car's sat-nav haywire, indicating the degree of digital interference being generated with GPS. So how did two drones manage to strike the Kremlin building in this way? You might speculate, maybe, that the protection could have been briefly turned off for the purpose specifically of allowing the strike to happen, which would obviously point to a false flag event, the purpose of which we can speculate about in a moment. You might similarly speculate that certain drone technology may have been developed that could withstand Moscow's attempts at disruption, although it probably wouldn't even need to be that sophisticated. The target was, after all, highly distinctive and visible, so you wouldn't have needed accurate guidance systems necessarily, depending how it was being controlled. In the immediate aftermath, the Russian leadership has naturally blamed Ukraine for the attack, and then barely a beat later, it blamed Washington. Now, even if it wasn't a false flag attack, and even though Putin clearly does sincerely believe that Washington directs a lot of what Kyiv chooses to do, I don't think for 2 seconds that they genuinely believe Washington just tried to bomb the Kremlin. If they do, it's the most dangerous moment we've ever faced. After all, if a country directly launches a potentially deadly attack, however underpowered, against your capital building, it is as clear an act of war as anything you could imagine. It would justify an immediate shift onto war footing against NATO from Russia, which, again, if it believed its own rhetoric, would be looking to hit back against Washington, not against Kyiv. But that's not going to happen because it would be a massive escalation, and Russia knows full well that it would be based on a falsehood. So, what exactly is going on? Claims that it was a Russian false flag attack sit strangely against the fact that it was, at least to some degree, played down on official state television. None of the released drone footage was shown, just library shots of the Kremlin. Some Western commentators argued that the fact the strike had happened was a deep embarrassment for Putin, since it was supposed to be one of the best defended buildings on the planet. Maybe that's true, although Western journalists are often rather bad at reading how the leaders of nations with very different histories and cultures actually see the world. But we'll leave that to one side for the moment. The rationale, if it were a false flag attack, again, I repeat, nobody knows, except for people who actually carried it out, of course, would be likely to rally sentiment within Russia itself to support a new level of escalation, namely mobilization. Feeling as though you're under attack is one of the most unifying forces you can bring to bear on a body of people, assuming that they believe it. But then why would you choose to then downplay it in the media? I mean, I suppose possibly because you're walking this fine line. You don't want to be seen as incompetent and out of control while you're stressing that someone has successfully attacked you. Hence it was stressed that the Kremlin was not damaged by the attack. But you do want to demonstrate to the people that the enemy will and can strike at the heart of their own country, so they should be prepared to defend it. Now that's a possibility. It has arguments for and against it. Another possible motive for a false flag would be to plant the thought in the United States and NATO that Ukraine can't be trusted with the long-range weapons that they keep asking for. Anything that drives a wedge between Zelensky and his allies would be seen as a major war aim for Moscow. Some have said that it couldn't have been such a thing because it just makes the Kremlin look inept and weak, so therefore they would never have done it. But even if that outcome is true, your theories as to who did it shouldn't so lightly discount the possibility of poor decision-making on the part of whoever did it. There has, after all, been rather a lot of poor decision-making through the history of this conflict. Mostly, but certainly not exclusively, on the Russian side. Nevertheless, for all that Zelensky immediately denied responsibility, the modus operandi for the attack is certainly compatible with Ukraine's approach to using such weapons, as we've seen recently. So again, you start by asking, well, if that's the case, what's the objective of the strike? Since it clearly wasn't to actually take out Putin. One theory is that it puts pressure on how Russia organises its air defences to seek to defend itself. Russia's surface-to-air missiles that are the core of its air defence are of the type, for instance, of the S-400. These weigh over 5,000 pounds and move at up to 3,000 miles per hour. Not exactly your first weapon of choice for downing extremely cheap, small-sized drones. Weapons that would be more in line with that threat would be shorter range by their nature. But when you look at the full area covered by the range that a Ukrainian drone might have, you'd need rather a lot of defences to defend the full scale of the territory. Ukraine's small drones can't pack much of a punch, as the Kremlin attack demonstrated, so they would strategically be best used against targets that are vulnerable to even a small explosion. Things like fuel tanks, other aspects of logistics or infrastructure, for instance. If you were Russia, you would design your limited air defence cover to focus on those areas. But suppose there are other targets that, even if they don't get heavily damaged, are high profile and politically embarrassing when they get hit, like, indeed, the Kremlin. But there will be countless others. That then encourages some of those air defences to get more thinly spread out, leaving gaps that may be exploitable. For this strategy, it's enough that the embarrassment was caused by the Kremlin being hit. Obviously, it neither requires nor expects that President Putin would ever have been personally in danger, so it's at least commensurate with the style of attack that was made. It's hard to think of any Ukrainian actors who would imagine that putting Putin in fear of his own life would lead to better outcomes for Ukraine. More likely to make the Russians escalate to nuclear options or more determinedly try to take out Zelensky. Now, of course, the most rabid pro-war Russian military bloggers and commentators have been calling predictably for exactly that. Take out Zelensky in retaliation for this. And they would demand that, of course, just because they would anyway, on the grounds that he once looked at President Putin funny or whatever. So that is the least interesting aspect of all of this, and Russian state TV hasn't given a huge amount of weight to those voices on this occasion. But they are at least a symptom of the other possible motivation, which is to provide further fuel to the destabilisation of the political situation in Russia. In this telling, it could be Ukraine, it could be Russian partisans who could have engineered it to embarrass Putin and show him up as being weak. Russian security analyst Mark Galeotti wrote in The Spectator that Ukraine will have wanted to demonstrate that Moscow is not beyond reach of the consequences of a war, and to do so immediately prior to the 9th of May military parade. There's some scepticism as to whether Russian partisans, whether pro or anti-war, would have had the capacity to get past the Kremlin's defences, or have themselves been sufficiently well organised enough to take this sort of action undetected. The version that I discount out of hand is the Kremlin's telling that the United States directly or indirectly organised it. That would be such a colossal risk, for no imaginable gain that would remotely justify it. It doesn't even bear contemplation. Now, the US is certainly capable of taking various sorts of deniable actions if they believe that they will further their interests. It would be pretty astonishing if any of them had concluded that a direct attack on the Kremlin building was amongst the bright ideas that they should pursue. So where does this leave us? Well, the situation is tense. Not as tense as it would be if the Russians believed their own propaganda. And very quickly, other factors take over in any case. Indeed, just today we saw the head of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, angrily denouncing the Kremlin in a video where he posed with a pile of fresh corpses. He said his forces would leave Bakhmut in 5 days, where they have been taking heavy losses. And he said this: "I'm pulling Wagner units out of Bakhmut because in the absence of ammunition, they are doomed to perish senselessly." At some point, such interventions are likely to provoke a meaningful response. Wagner has been provoking the Kremlin quite a lot recently. It's a reminder that the real political game in Russia is being fought out internally, and anyone who wishes to see Russia take a less destructive course would probably be fully aware that the last way you'd bring about that would be by trying or succeeding in assassinating President Vladimir Putin.